Okay, welcome to part 2 of the reproductive system screencast. We are on the female menstrual cycle. It's really the last big topic, but there's a fair amount that goes on here. So what we're going to do is go over the two different parts, the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle, and we'll talk about which hormones cause which events to happen. And then we'll put it all together and talk about sort of all the events in sequence. What you want to focus on is individual events, because this is not something that you will have to explain in an essay question. It does get a little complicated, but if you don't really grasp all of it, that's okay, as long as you can break it up into little bits. So we are going to start with, there we go, the ovarian cycle. So this is, let me review real quick. So one of the things you want to keep track of with the different cycles is which hormones are doing what and where they come from. So for the ovarian cycle, it's going to be the pituitary hormones, LH and FSH, that are regulating events in the ovaries, and then the ovaries are going to release ovarian hormones, and they are going to be regulating the uterine cycle. So they all kind of mesh together. So starting first with the ovarian cycle. First up, you just want to know what the three phases are. The follicular phase is just when the follicle is developing or growing, and this is stimulated by follicle-stimulating hormone. Now we finally understand where it gets its name. Then on or about day 14, ovulation occurs. You want to know that this is triggered by luteinizing hormone. Then following ovulation, the parts or the cells of the follicle that are still in the ovary develop into the corpus luteum. This is where luteinizing hormone gets its name, because the development and maintenance of the corpus luteum is promoted by luteinizing hormone. And this you want to know secretes or manufactures progesterone. I could also point out that estrogen comes from the ovary, not the ovaries, the follicles, but that's a part of the cycle that I don't go into detail about because it's just too much. Then, towards the end of the luteal phase, the corpus luteum degenerates into what is called a corpus albicans, if no pregnancy occurs. If pregnancy occurs, then the corpus luteum is going to be maintained for up to 3 months and continue cranking out progesterone. And later on, you'll see why that's important. So establishing the ovarian cycle, and I should say this goes for the whole menstrual cycle, both the ovarian and the uterine cycle. Really what you want to take away from this slide is leptin. So during childhood and puberty, you do not have a lot of GnRH. When leptin shows up, leptin is the signal to the hypothalamus to start producing GnRH, and that's what gets the cycle going. This little bit here is just an interesting anecdote, or might explain things that you know or have experienced. Leptin comes from adipose tissue, so in very lean female athletes, they sometimes have delayed menarche. They don't enter puberty until a little bit later because they don't have as much leptin. So now we are on to the uterine cycle. This slide just kind of goes over the major events of the uterine cycle. So you just want to know that it starts in the menstrual phase, days 1 through 5, which is just the shedding of the uterine endometrium. And then the proliferative and the secretory phase, we want to know a few more details about. So again, days 1 through 5, menstruation or menses. And then 6 through 14 on average is called the proliferative phase. Here you want to know that estrogen is causing the uterine endometrium to get thicker. So you've got a lot of mitosis and growth going on in the uterine endometrium. then following ovulation, the uterine switches into the secretory phase. This is promoted by rising levels of progesterone, which just changes sort of the architecture of the endometrium and encourages it to secrete the mucus and other substances that are going to be required for the development of a placenta and the maintenance of the placenta. So that's the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle, both relatively straightforward. So this is just a quick review of where the different hormones come from. So estrogen comes from the follicles, and then in between posting the PowerPoints and making this screencast, I added the corpus luteum. It's not something that I emphasize, but the hormones make more sense if you know that estrogen comes from both of those structures. And then progesterone is only secreted by the corpus luteum. And then you want to remember that luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone come from the pituitary. So now what we're going to do is go through all of the events of the menstrual cycle, both ovarian and uterine cycle, and all of the hormone changes that precipitate all of those events. And so just concentrate on individual events. Don't worry about being able to describe the whole thing. So in the beginning, this is just our hormones here. We have relatively low levels of estrogen and progesterone. And compared to the end of the previous cycle, you've got somewhat elevated levels of LH and FSH. So this is promoting follicular growth. And if you note here, right, as the follicle grows, this is your estrogen levels starting to go up because the follicle's getting bigger. So as estrogen levels start to rise, that triggers this rise here in estrogen is what triggers the LH surge up here coming from the pituitary. So early on in the cycle, estrogen is actually inhibiting FSH and LH, and then as it rises, some flip is switched where estrogen becomes, or I should say, exerts positive feedback on the hypothalamus. This is why when we did the LH and FSH regulation in the endocrine chapter, we just said it's both positive and negative feedback. Because in this one time period here, this is where you get a positive feedback effect of estrogen on LH and FSH. So now, following ovulation, now we're here in the ovarian cycle, just to review. You get the formation of the corpus luteum, and then the corpus luteum is going to be secreting both estrogen and progesterone. So if we look up here again, now you see a rise in progesterone and a rise in estrogen. The rise in these two hormones is what's causing this decline here. So as estrogen and progesterone go up, LH and FSH go down. And because, if we go down here, right, the progesterone is what is supporting the secretory phase of the uterine cycle. As progesterone levels start to decline, the endometrium starts to degenerate, and this decline here is what triggers entry into menses. This slide I put in just to show all of the interactions and that it's super more complicated than we even talked about. But you can see, especially looking here, estrogen is negative feedback in most of the cycle, but mid-cycle there's that positive feedback loop that causes this spike here in LH. So if fertilization doesn't occur, as it says here, the corpus luteum is going to degenerate, progesterone and estrogen levels will fall, the endometrium will begin to degenerate, and you'll enter menses, and that is going to start the next cycle. So that's the whole cycle from beginning to end. You don't need to be able to describe it in detail, but you should be familiar with all of the events. And this is a nice figure that just sort of puts together what's happening in the ovary, in the uterus, and what are the levels of your ovarian and pituitary hormones. So if you do get fertilization, there is a hormone produced by the placenta called HCG, or human chorionic gonadotropin. That maintains the corpus luteum so that LH levels are still going to fall, but you're still going to have a corpus luteum, which is still going to be churning out progesterone, and that is what's going to maintain the uterine endometrium so that the pregnancy can be supported. I'm not going to go over this whole slide. This is just a summary of all the different functions in males and females of all of the different hormones. So it's a good little review sheet. Mammary glands we don't spend a lot of time on. Really, you just want to know that they exist and that they are modified sweat glands. I will not spend a lot of time on this slide either. I usually don't put a lot of questions about breast cancer on the exam. I wish I had more time and expertise to do this topic justice, but I do think it's worth just reviewing a few things that we do know, like some of the risk factors. So early entry into menstruation, a late first pregnancy or never getting pregnancy, and a family history of breast cancer are all risk factors. As well as there are 2 genes that if you inherit the mutation in those genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2, that also increases your risk of developing breast cancer. What's most troubling about breast cancer is that understanding the risk factors are still not very good predictors of who's actually going to get breast cancer. It's part of what makes it really so scary, because you don't know whether you're safe or not. So I just left that in there, but again, probably won't ask very many questions about it. That is the end of the reproductive system. You've made it through another one, and that was only 12 minutes.